Hello and welcome to the course Developing Soft Skills and Leadership through Indian Knowledge System. In today's lecture, which is about moral authority and decision making, we shall be trying to establish a kind of relationship and correspondence between moral authority, decision making and leadership, particularly the ethical and servant leadership we shall be talking about. So, when we look at this idea of what you call moral authority and decision making, this has been a kind of relationship. There has been a very close relationship rather between moral authority and decision making, particularly if we explore the areas such as Indian knowledge system, because in Indian knowledge system authority has never been related with the idea of power, rather it has already been authority is something which is negotiated with the idea of what you call morality and ethics, right. So, before we begin with a deep analysis of this particular topic, particularly establishing a relationship between moral authority and decision making, let us quickly look at how some great people define the idea of what you call moral authority. For example, if you look at Mahatma Gandhi, who has deliberated on the concept of moral authority, in one of his statements states that moral authority arises from the concept of truth, what you call Satya, and non-violence, which is called ahimsa, right. So, for Mahatma Gandhi, moral authority, right, does not come from what you call the concept of power or authority or what you call hegemony, rather it comes from truth and non-violence, which means if the leaders practice this concept of truth and non-violence, probably the leadership has that kind of moral authority, or moral authority is immediately practiced by the leaders. At the same time, Mahatma Gandhi also believes that decision making must align with conscience rather than power or convenience, right. So, it is very clear in his definition that he has completely divorced this idea of moral authority from the generally understood concept that authority is always associated with power. Rather, what he says is that it is more aligned with conscience, with non-violence and truth. So, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi believes that moral authority comes from the idea of truth and non-violence, and decision is more related with conscience rather than power or what you call convenience. Similarly, if you look at the ideas of Rabindranath Tagore, we find that he also expressed that moral authority emerges from the idea of harmony between the individual and the universal, right. So, if we closely analyze the statement of Rabindranath Tagore, we find that what he is trying to establish is that there must be a harmony between the individual and the universal. Means the individual should not be observed or thought and considered as somebody who is isolated, or his or her actions are isolated, particularly in cases where the individual is acting as a leader, right. So, if you are acting as a leader, your ideas, you must try to establish what you call a harmony between an individual and universal. There must be a close association with the individual and universal. That means every kind of decision that is taken at individual level must be what you call thrown towards, must be considered towards the larger good of the larger people. That means should consider about the welfare or collective welfare of the larger public, right. So, there should not be a kind of any kind of universal laws or universal decisions which must lead to individual what you call isolation, and there must not be any kind of individual decisions which must not be in correspondence with the universal, right. So, he is trying to establish a connection between the individual and the universal, and therefore, according to him, decision making should be upheld in terms of human dignity and freedom, right. So, before making any kind of decision, the leaders must think about human dignity and human freedom, right. So, you see that how both Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore have related the idea of moral authority with truth and non-violence, and the relationship between the individual and the universal, and decision making with conscience, human dignity and freedom. Similarly, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar have tried to talk about moral authority, particularly in terms of justice and equality, right. Almost reflecting the similar kind of ideas. He is trying to say that moral authority, or authority rather, must be justified in terms of justice and equality, right. Justice and equality towards all, irrespective of caste, creed, religion, color, etc. And all kind of decisions should be rational, constitutional and socially inclusive, right. So, any kind of decisions that are made, particularly by the leaders who are in power, right, these decisions must be rooted, deeply rooted in the idea of logic or rationality, and they must also be rooted in the constitutional ideas, constitutional equality, and at the same time should be socially inclusive, right. So, we are trying to look at the moral authority and decision making as something which is related with, which is accountable for what you call the larger good of the larger people, right. So, moral authority is something which is not rooted in the idea of power or hegemony. Rather, authority is always sought from the larger public. And how can we seek authority from larger public? When we try to look at, when we try to address the larger good or welfare of the larger people as such. So, when we look at this idea of moral authority and decision making, particularly in Indian knowledge system, we know that Indian philosophy, Indian philosophical traditions and Indian knowledge system has largely been emphasizing upon the fact that moral authority arises when leadership is guided by the concept of dharma, wisdom and ethical conduct, right. So, we know that it is always been the case that moral authority in Indian knowledge system has always been decided by dharma, which is called righteous action, right, wisdom, which means intellect, and ethical conduct, ethical and moral conduct of the leader, right. So, we know that in Indian knowledge system, moral authority has never been associated with the idea of power and hegemony. Rather, it is more related with dharma, right. For example, leaders have a dharma, and that dharma is an ethical duty of a leader which is very countable or related with the larger good of the larger people. Similarly, this idea of decision making at the same time, as per Indian knowledge system, is not something administrative, right. So, we know that decision making has never been considered in Indian knowledge system as something which is just administrative, right. Rather, it is more related with the idea of ethics, social responsibility, and is deeply rooted in the concept of dharma, what you call righteous conduct, right. So, decision making can never be separated from the ideas such as ethics, social responsibility and dharma, which is called righteous action. Rather, it is deeply rooted in these concepts. So, it is not something which is just isolated in terms of administration. Rather, it has a larger understanding, it is a very wider understanding. Decision making has what you call, it's multifaceted. We have to, decision making has to be very responsible towards society, towards individual and towards the ethics and morality as such. And therefore, this moral authority is deeply grounded in ethical integrity, while decision making is its practical expression in leadership, right. So, we know that moral authority, the idea of moral authority is deeply grounded in ethical integrity of the leaders, while when you look at decision making, it is a kind of a practical expression of the idea of moral authority itself in leadership, right. So, moral authority is more theoretical in nature, while decision making is a practical use of that moral authority as such. When we look at the concept of moral authority further in Indian thought, we know that authority is rooted in Dharma, which is called cosmic and social order. We know that every leader has certain kind of Dharma, or what you call his duties, which have been defined as duties. Dharma is not religion. We have clarified it many times while we have expressed this particular concept of Dharma. Dharma is something which is defined as duty of an individual and duty of a particular post, right. So, if you are holding a position of a leader, you have certain Dharma, which is a cosmic and social order, right. It is also rooted in the idea of Satya, what you call truth, and this Satya is not individual, it's more related with the larger public, larger good of the larger public, and at the same time the authority must also be rooted in the idea of universal law, what we call Rita. And therefore, the ultimate aim of moral authority must be to promote what you call collective welfare, or what we have expressed in Indian knowledge system as something called lok sangra, right. So, the ultimate aim of the authority is to establish what you call collective welfare, or what you call lok sangra, right. And it is something different from what you call Western traditions, because in Western traditions ethics have always been separated from daily life, while in Indian knowledge system we have always viewed ethics of as something associated with morality, knowledge, actions, and all of them are inseparable, right. So, that means we have never treated these concepts such as morality, knowledge, decision making as something inseparable. Rather, every kind of action, every kind of knowledge, every kind of morality and ethics must be socially oriented, means everything is closely related with what you call the collective welfare. In Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna defines yad yada chariti Shresthat tadevataro jana sa yat pramanam kurute lokasta danu vartate, which means whatever a great person does, others follow, right. The entire world imitates the example set by that person through his actions. So, what Lord Krishna is trying to suggest here is that the leaders have a greater responsibility on themselves. Why? Because leaders are being followed, leaders are being imitated in the society. So, in order to what you call completely control the social fabric, the leaders must act ethically and morally, because it is a morality and ethics, it is examples of morality and ethics established by the leaders that others follow, and the entire world rather imitates the kinds of examples set by that person through his actions. We always consider in Indian knowledge system Lord Ram as a perfect example of what you call moral and ethical leadership, right, because through his examples he has set certain kind of morality and ethical behavior that every one of us try to follow that particular thing, right. So, Lord Ram is a best example of very responsible moral and ethical leadership, right. So, what we learned from this shloka from Bhagavad Gita is that the leader's conduct is a kind of a moral benchmark for society, right. So, it is treated, whatever the leader's conduct is always treated as something moral benchmark for society, and therefore, everyone who is following that particular leader tries to meet that particular moral benchmark set by the leader, and therefore, it is a greater responsibility on the leaders to act morally and ethically, and therefore, moral authority is always driven from ethical action, not formal power, right. So, the kind of authority that is practiced in society by the leaders is always derived from his ethical action, not formal power, right. And we know that why we always give that kind of moral authority to Lord Ram is because we always follow his ethical actions, right, or he has rather set some ethical action through which he has derived that kind of moral authority that we have always looked forward to him, not any kind of formal power. It's we respect Lord Ram not because he was a king of Ayodhya, but rather because of his ethical and moral actions that he has always set. And therefore, we must learn that leaders shape collective behavior through lived examples, right. So, we know that the leaders are in a position rather to shape the collective behavior of the society at large, right, through the kind of examples that he has set, right. So, there is a very close connection between the leaders' practices, moral and ethical practices, and the kind of society that he or she is shaping. Now, another thing that has been prescribed in Indian knowledge system and that we borrow from Kamandakya Nitisara is the idea of self-mastery, which means in order to become moral and ethical leader, the leader first of all must discipline himself. It is stated, Atmanam Prathamam Raja Viniyon Papadayet, which means a ruler must first discipline himself, right. So, what happens is that in order to become what you call moral and ethical authority, first of all you have to discipline yourself, you have to control your own inner self and discipline yourself, right. Because if you want others to follow you, right, you must make yourself in that particular position first. And the kind of things that we learn from this sloka, what this sloka suggests is that moral authority begins with self-discipline and inner governance. So, a leader who is moral in nature first of all must practice the idea of self-discipline and inner governance. First you improve yourself and then probably put yourself, or rather if you are self-disciplined and govern your inner self, you have a moral authority comes to you naturally. We know that humility is the one which may transform power into ethical leadership. If ethical leadership or ethical leader practice the idea of humility, right, that they may transform the idea of power into what you call ethical leadership, right. So, that comes naturally to those leaders who have humility in themselves, right. So, a leader therefore must govern the self before governing the others, right. What happens is that probably if we look at the modern concept of leadership, we find that this idea has been understood as upside down, right. The leaders are not trying to govern their self, rather they are trying to govern others first, and that is why there is a problem in modern leadership. They must learn from Indian knowledge system which says Atmanam Prathamam Raja, which means you should govern yourself first before governing the others, right. So, this is how what we learn from Kamandakya Nitisara about governing and discipline yourself first before governing others. Now, when we look at Amrita Bindu Upanishad, it is stated that Man evam manushyanam karanam bandha mokshayo bandhaye vishayasaktam muktaye nirvishayam smratam, which means for human beings the mind alone is the cause of bondage and liberation. We know that it is mind which creates everything, right. So, what happens is that it is a mind which is cause of bondage and liberation, and therefore, you must control your mind first. You must be in a position to discipline your mind, right, because it is a mind that is attached to the objects of the senses. If a mind is attached to the objects of senses, is always regarded as the cause of bondage, right. And what happens is like the mind which is always attached with objects of senses is a problem, right? And the mind which is unattached to the objects of senses is regarded as the cause of liberation. So, the first thing is that you should detach your mind from the objects. What you should do is detach your mind from objects, right. So, you should not be related, associated with materiality, with the concept or with the what you call senses as such, right, because otherwise then your mind is always in bondage. You are always trying to look for your own comfort, you are trying to look for your own power, etc., right. So, you should first of all liberate your mind, unattach your mind from objects and senses as a leader, right. And we have many examples from Indian knowledge system where leaders have left everything behind, right, without any kind of attachment to objects and senses. We have the examples of Lord Ram and Sita, who have left the comfort of the palaces and have gone to jungle, right, gone to woods, right, because they were not associated with the objects and senses. And this is precisely what Lord Krishna calls sthiti pragya, right, somebody who is not associated with what you call materiality, somebody who is not associated with the result of a particular thing rather. So, what kind of suggestions that this particular shloka offers is that moral authority always originates in control of the mind, right. So, first of all you must control your mind. It should not be attached with objects, it should not be attached with materiality, it should not be attached with the result of things. And therefore, if you practice such kind of things, this would bring you what you call inner discipline, and inner discipline would determine the ethical leadership. And therefore, detachment always enables just and unbiased authority, just and unbiased authority. Now, if you look at Valmiki's Ramayana, particularly in Ayodhya Kand, right, it is stated Satyamev anarsansa cha rajavrittam sanatanam tasma atsa satya atmakam rajyam satya lokah pratishtati. Means truth and non-violence are the eternal principles of king. What should a king should do is that he must think that eternal principles that a king should follow is the idea of truth and non-violence, and therefore a kingdom is founded on the concept of truth. If the kingdom is founded on the concept of truth, the world itself stands established in truth, right. So, what is being prescribed here is that the king must follow the concept of truth and non-violence, right. What we learn from this particular shloka is that moral authority overweighs political power, right. So, as a leader, you should not exercise the political power over the people, rather you should exercise moral authority. And how does this moral authority come to you? If you take care of your people, if you think about the larger good of the larger people, if you think about the lok sangra, right, collective welfare of the people, you have moral authority, right. Instead of practicing power, political power over the people, should practice moral authority. And at the same time, this legitimacy is always rooted in the kind of righteousness, not force. And as a king, as a leader, you should never practice force to rule your or to act in a team, to rule or to act in an organization, to lead an organization. Rather, should always practice the idea of righteousness. So, legitimacy is always in righteousness, not in force, right. This is something you must remember. Even if you are working in a modern organization, you are working in society or anywhere, you must think that you should practice righteousness, always do right thing, follow truthfulness, and think about the collective welfare of the individual. Then probably you can have the idea of moral authority, and your moral authority is always legitimized. When we further look at the idea of decision making within Indian knowledge system, I hope you have a fair idea now about what we mean by moral authority and how moral authority is something which is established and practiced by a leader. How can a leader transform his power into what you call moral authority, which is related with the larger good of the larger people, practicing righteousness, etc. Now, when we look at this concept of decision making, we know that moral authority is demonstrated through the practice of right decision making, right. And when we look at this concept of decision making within Indian knowledge system, we know that in Indian knowledge system it is always emphasized that decisions which are to be guided by righteousness, intellect and ethical responsibility. So, all decisions must be guided by righteousness, intellect, what we call buddhi and ethical responsibility, right. So, we have already talked about how decision making is a kind of demonstration of moral authority in terms of righteousness, intellect and ethical responsibility. And there must be a kind of a fair balance between shreyas and prayas, which means long term growth and short term pleasure, right. We know that every act, every decision that we make, right, always has two factors. One is that it brings immediate pleasure and it must also be at the same time bring long term growth, right. So, any kind of decision that is made must be balanced, right. It should not just be about immediate pleasure, but in long term it may result in what you call in some kind of disturbances, right. It should bring about pleasure, but at the same time must ensure long term growth of the entire society or team or organization where you are working, wherever you are working. The decision making, or rather ethical decision making, must also consider desh, kal and paristhiti, which are called time, place and situation. Desh, kal and paristhiti, right, place, time and situation, right. So, we know that the kind of decisions that we make are not universal most of the times, right. They are subjected to the context, right. So, the time affects your decision making and place, so wherever you are, right. So, one particular decision may be applicable to one particular place and time, may not be applicable to different place and time and the situation, which is called paristhiti, right. So, whenever we have to make a decision, we must consider the desh, kal and paristhiti, right, and we should not think that every decision is applicable and should be applied and taken in terms of universality, right. Now, how should we engage in the concept of what we call decision making? In Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna suggests deliberation before any kind of decision, right. So, every decision which has to be taken must be deliberated, must be thought about, must be discussed before taking any kind of decision. So, what he says is that pravartim cha nivrattim cha karya karye bhayavahe bandham moksha chaya veti buddhida sa parth sattviki, which means, O Parth, O Arjun, that understanding is sattvic which knows engagement and withdrawal, and ought to be done and what ought not to be done, fear and fearlessness, bondage and liberation, right. So, what he is suggesting is that before taking any kind of decision, or that particular kind of understanding is sattvic, which knows how to engage, at the same time how to withdraw, and where and what things should be discussed, what should not be discussed, what things should be withdrawn, ought to be done, what ought to be done and what ought not to be done, fear and fearlessness, bondage and liberation, right. So, every decision must be considered, right, in terms of what you call engagement, withdrawal, ethicality and which should not be done, what is fear about it, what is fearlessness, bondage and liberation. So, what we learn from this shloka from Bhagavad Gita is that decisions must be thoughtful and not impulsive. You may take time to make a decision. It should not be impulsive. Right? Take your time before you make a decision, but they must be thoughtful, they must be logical, they must be deliberated, they must be discussed. At the same time, if you make thoughtful decisions will always prevent ethical failure. Right? So, there are always chances that if your decisions are quite thoughtful, there are going to be least chance of ethical failure. Right? So, what it simply means, if I try to explain it in a very simple words, is that every decision must be deliberated before actually practiced or implied or applied. In further Rigveda, it is suggested that decision making should be collective. Decision making should be collective, because if the decision making has a wider consequence, it should be collective. Therefore, what is said is Sangachadvam, Samvadhatvam, Samvo Manas Janatam. Move together, speak together, and let your mind be in harmony. Right? So, it means that decision making must be collective. You must come together, speak together, discuss and reach to a particular consensus. Your mind must be in harmony, means every kind of decision must be collective. Right? What Rigveda here envisions is that decisions are collaborative and dialogic process. So, every kind of decision which is made must be a kind of collaborative effort. It should not be an individual's choice. A decision should not be an individual's choice, rather it should be collaborative. And a dialogic process, a process of discussion and dialogue must be adopted before making a decision. That means there must be quite deep and long discussion before any kind of decisions are made. Right? So, for example, if you are working in an organization and you have a team to work with, you must discuss and collaborate before making any kind of decisions, because shared consciousness is the foundation of ethical leadership. If your consciousness is shared, probably it would be the foundation of what you call ethical leadership. And therefore, collective thinking reduces any kind of bias or improves clarity. So, if you are making decisions collectively, there are chances that you are less biased and rather clarity is being improved. And therefore, inclusive dialogue leads to balanced decisions. So, if you accommodate dialogues, if you accommodate discussion, it would lead to balanced decisions, and unity in thought probably ensures effective execution of your decisions. Right? So, if people agree with your decision, probably there are chances that your decisions are going to be executed, implemented in a very clear and unambiguous manner. In Kautilya in Arthashastra has talked about pragmatic decisions, right? How pragmatic decisions are being made. And what it suggests is that karmanam arambhopaya purusha dravya sampada deshakal vibhagya vinipat pratikara kar siddhiriti panchango mantra. He provides 5 mantras, 5 essential components of effective plan, what you call decision making. The first is that there must be a very clear method for initiating action, which he calls karmanam arambhopaya, which means you must have a very clear method of initiating a particular action. Right? The availability of capable human and material resources means your decision must be rooted in the availability of the what you call resources, material and human, right, which you call purusha dravya sampada. And then proper consideration of place and time. We have already discussed this concept that every decision must be rooted in desh, kal and vibhaga, which is called place and time. Right? So, none of the decision is universal, rather they are very contextual in nature, that must be considered. And then you must also be prepared for what you call, in order to handle unforeseen obstacles, vinipat pratikara. Right? And finally, ultimately the successful accomplishment of the task. Ultimately, the successful accomplishment of the task, which is called karya siddhiriti. So, if you are you have a very clear method of implementing or initiating action. If you are thinking about the material and human resources, you think about place and timing, and you are ready to handle unforeseen obstacles, probably your work or decision is always right or accomplished, right. So, these are the 5 processes that Arthashastra is suggesting to us in order to make what we call practical or pragmatic decisions. So, decision making in Arthashastra is deeply pragmatic, emphasizing outcomes to be contingent upon the appropriateness of means rather than intent alone. It also talks about that success of a decision always depends on choosing the right means, right, and strategic planning strengthens decision making. So, this is the strategic planning that he suggests, right, and if you want your success to be achieved in terms of decision making, it depends upon the right means that you adopt in order to make certain kind of decisions. Further, in Arthashastra, it is also suggested that there is a very close connection between the leader and the subject, or the leader and the team, the leader and the organization, and that is what that, and therefore he says that a decision must be welfare oriented. Decision must be welfare oriented, means you should always think about the larger public while making a decision. What he says is that pragya sukhe sukham ragya pragyanam tu hite hitam natma priyam hitam ragya prajanam tu priyam hitam, right. The happiness of the subject lies in the happiness of the king. In their welfare lies his welfare. What pleases the king personally is not beneficial, what pleases the subjects is truly beneficial, right. So, what it simply means that the king's happiness lies in the happiness of the subject. So, the king should not think about his personal benefit, rather he should always seek the benefit, or what you call pleasure, in the benefit of his subjects. The welfare of the larger public is more important, right. So, there is a very close connection between Raja or leader and the subject, or the team and the organization, right. Any kind of decision that a leader takes must be welfare oriented towards the team, the organization and the subject. So, what we learned from this particular shloka is that public welfare should be central in decision making. All kind of decisions that are made must orient towards public welfare, and if welfare decisions are made, the welfare always drives decisions, that it ensures stability, and all kind of ethical decisions must override personal preferences, right. So, you should not think about your own benefit, your own personal choices, rather you think about the larger people. So, moral authority and decision making are not something which is we have discussed that are related with what we call ancient knowledge system only. When we try to borrow and apply the ideas of moral authority and decision making, particularly lying in the Indian knowledge system, we know that they have the potential of shaping the modern leadership, right. And how can modern leadership learn from the ancient knowledge system is that when we look at Indian knowledge system, we find that effective leadership emerges from the fusion of moral authority and wise decision making, right. And they have always been creating leaders who are both principled and pragmatic, right. So, we know and we have learned that there is a fusion of moral authority and wise decision making in Indian knowledge system, and Indian knowledge system through many examples is demonstrating and creating leaders who are both principled and pragmatic at the same time. We know that the modern leadership may also learn that leadership is context sensitive. Leadership is context sensitive means you must consider the context before making any kind of decisions, right. Decisions are always shaped by the idea of time, place and situation. We have always discussed and already discussed that decision making is not something universal, right, it is always subjected to time, place and situation. One decision which may be applicable to one time, place and situation may not be applicable to other time, place and situation, right. The other thing that we modern leadership should learn from the Indian knowledge system is the idea of detached judgment. Judgment which is free from all kind of ego, personal bias and attachment to outcomes, right. You shouldn't think that you shouldn't make any kind of decision from position of your ego or any kind of personal bias, right. And that is why we have always talked about the collective decision making, right, and should not be attached to outcomes. You should not think about what benefit you are going to derive from this decision making. Rather, you should think about the larger people, the larger good of the larger people. And we have also learned that ethics from practicality, balancing between dharma and real world challenges, right. So, the leadership must be ethical with practicality at the same time, balancing the personal duty and the real world challenges. And finally, the modern leadership may learn from reflective decision processes, which has been emphasizing the emphasis on thought, analysis and inner clarity before any kind of action. When we look at educational impact of Indian knowledge system, particularly in terms of moral authority and decision making, we know that modern education shapes the latter into value driven and reflective processes. So, if we try to integrate moral authority and decision making in modern education system, it may help in shaping the modern education in terms of a value driven and reflective processes. So, if we try to teach our students that you should always think about from the perspective of moral authority before making any kind of decision, I think there must be some kind of value addition into our education system. It must also be taught that learning must be contextual, right. Students should learn to apply knowledge based on real life situations, right. So, you should for example practice this particular thing that you have a problem, but you see that how this particular problem may have different kind of solution depending upon the kind of situation that is around you. It may also help in development of independent thinking in the students, which may encourage thoughtful judgment rather than just rote learning, right. So, the ultimate aim of introducing Indian knowledge system and educational impact in terms of moral authority and decision making is to create independent thinkers, where they must be encouraged to be thoughtful, encouraged to have thoughtful judgment rather than just rote learning. At the same time, they should also learn to have ethical reasoning skills, which may foster ability to distinguish right from wrong actions. And finally, discipline and self-regulation may also be learned in terms of moral authority and decision making, which may promote control over thoughts and actions. So, if we try to conclude today's discussion in this particular lecture, we know that in Indian knowledge system leadership is not merely exercised, it is embodied, where moral authority shapes decisions and decisions reinforce moral authority, right. So, there is a very close and mutual relationship between what you call moral authority and what you call decision making. So, it depends upon what kind, if you have moral authority, if you practice moral authority, your decisions are going to be ethical, decisions are going to be what you call based on collective welfare, right. And if you make decisions which are about the larger people, right, this is going to reinforce moral authority. So, both of them are shaping each other, moral authority and ethical decision making. It may further create a kind of a continuous cycle of ethical conduct and responsible action on the part of the leader. And it may further foster a leadership model which is grounded in self-discipline, reflective thinking and a deep commitment to what you call collective welfare. Right. So, we know that how this moral authority and leadership are going to create a kind of leadership which is deeply committed to collective welfare, and such an approach may ensure that leadership remains not only effective in practice, but also enduring in its moral legitimacy. Thank you for listening to me patiently. If you have any questions or doubts, kindly let me know.